Hello adventurers, and welcome back to my channel. Today I am here in Arkansas and I'm going to visit a place that I have never been before. This is actually the Prairie Grove Battlefield State Park, and I'm starting off today at the Overlook, which is just a short distance away from the actual entry to the park itself. Now here you can find a variety of different signs to kind of set the tone for what we're going to be seeing, and so I thought this was a great place to start out. Now I am here on a Sunday and they are open from 1 o'clock till 5 o'clock, and it's a little windy outside today, so this could be kind of interesting, but let's go. Now normally I recommend going to the visitor center first, finding out if they have a video, getting a little historic context, and then coming to each of the sites. However, today we're starting off a little bit differently by coming to this stop. I noticed that whenever I pulled this up on GPS, this stop actually comes up unless you type in Visitors Center or State Park Visitor Center. And so I thought this was a good way for you guys to see what is available at this first stop, but then show you in contrast what's available at the other stop as well. Now I am a huge person for getting brain wrinkles and learning a little bit about history and how it ties in from place to place to place. So let's read a little bit of this and find out what happened here. Now at this pull-off there are a variety of different signs, and you can see them going around the overlook, each one telling a little bit of the story of the Prairie Grove Battlefield. It says that we are at the hallowed grounds of the Prairie Grove Battlefield, where tragic loss of life and heroic deeds filled the day. And here we can see exactly where we are, and on the map overall you can see a few other points as well. Now the north is indicated with the blue, so that would be the federal troops, and then the rebel troops, or the south, would be here portrayed with the red. So where we are currently standing right here, this was actually a portion of the federal troops area, arriving just in time to bolster Brigadier General Herron's federal troops. Blunt's division poured down the hillside and into the fields below the West family homestead. Blunt rapidly deployed his troops and within minutes had over 4,000 men in line just before 4 p.m. Now, believe it or not, this is a sign that's telling us a little bit about some of the engagement that was happening, that was indicated on the map, and it would have taken place right in front of our eyes. Right now there's a bunch of cows here, so it's harder to imagine, but at the time this was a fierce movement, but with that fierce movement also came a slight disconnect, and as they advanced in two separate lines, they didn't communicate super well, and the Confederates started to move forward to take over and caused somewhat of a retreat in this very field. However, even though they were forced backwards, ultimately firepower really made a difference in this particular engagement. It said that the Confederate forces started to descend upon the fleeing troops and contained 4 regiments of the Arkansas and numbered well over 1,300 men. However, after several attempts by the Confederates to break through the Federal forces, they stubbornly continued to hold on to the orchard. And by this time, even though the Iowans and the Indians were running desperately low on ammunition, they remained dangerously outnumbered. And finally, Federal artillery took notice of the situation and handled it. Now see, like any other engagement that we learn about here on my channel, we learn that there are opposing forces within the battles and they have very different lines of communication. So for example, you have these big cannons and they would be a bit further back, and then you would have the people who would fight hand to hand or with guns at a close range. And because of that, because there's 2 separate lines, they would have someone who would run in between to deliver the message from the commanding officer. And sometimes that message would be a little slow, which is what happened here apparently. As it happened, the Federal troops were already trying to kind of pull away because they felt that they could not. And then finally the Federal artillery caught wind through this messaging system and started to fire back to give them the cover that they needed to be able to do what they needed to do. But again, this is just one stop and we're going to learn a lot more. In these signs, it mentions that there were several Native Americans who were also fighting in this engagement. And so I'm sure we'll find out a little bit more about their positioning and what brought them into this whenever we go over to the visitor center. Now, I just came inside of the visitor center, and I definitely encourage you to do this because there's a video here that sets the context for everything, including the stop that we stopped at a while ago. It puts everything into perspective, so it means a little bit more when you see those signs. See, before we had context of only the single engagement and the overlook. However, now we know that the reason this was such a big deal was because this was actually one of the bigger pieces of the theater. This is what kept the Confederates from going into Missouri. And we've gone to several different battlefields in this region and seen the story kind of play out. But long story short, the Federals actually controlled this portion of Arkansas. And they wanted to continue doing so because they wanted to have the port at Fort Smith available. Now, when we visited Fort Smith, we learned a little bit more about why this was important. But here it puts it into perspective as to what that meant exactly. So as we cruise around the battlefield today, we'll have some context now thanks to the video. But there's a few other things here that I think are kind of fascinating. So we're gonna go check out the small museum and learn who this building is actually named for. It is in fact named after this man right here. And this was a Confederate general who was in this region who fought in this very engagement. But long before he was here, there was some other history to kind of set the context for who he was and what else he was involved with. He actually was at Vicksburg, which we just were at, and it is said that even though Vicksburg was the largest, this was one of the more stringent and bloody battles here in the Arkansas area. And so it's kind of interesting to see this, but long story short, he fought for the Confederacy. His son went on to leave money to the state of Arkansas so that they could have this facility here. And even though the Confederates did not win this particular battle, they wanted to have a place for people to come and honor those in their families who might have fallen or fought. And so I think it's kind of an interesting place to set the context of the story. Now, what caused Arkansas to enter this battle in the first place? It was actually a state divided. And while there was a portion of the state that did not want to engage, the other portion did. And unfortunately, this brought a lot of people who might not have necessarily wanted to be engulfed in battle into the battle front and center. And when they ultimately voted to secede, they only had one person vote against it. And so as we're going through this section, it sets the context for us just a little bit more, and there's an additional video.
Arkansans from the uplands of northwest Arkansas tended to be against secession, whereas Arkansans from the lowlands of southeast Arkansas tended to be for secession.
It also says here that Arkansas had the smallest population of any Confederate state except Florida at the time, and Arkansas's percentage of slave population was 25% less than any other Confederate state, but Tennessee, which was 24%. Arkansas's percentage of whites involved in slavery was the lowest, with 20%. Now, why does that matter, though? Well, it's because in all reality, many of the reasons why Arkansas ended up entering into the war were not based on just slavery alone. And a lot of people think that that is the main reason behind every single portion of who was interacting with the war itself. But in all reality, that wasn't the case with many people in some of these states. Well, some of them, yes, but not all of them. And so here we get to learn a little bit more about those people and why, but also how their contributions to various battles actually changed the landscape of some of these forward pushes and engagements. Here we have three different battles. We have Wilson's Creek, which is in Missouri, Pea Ridge, which is just north of here, and Cane Hill, which I believe is just a little bit south of this location. And here you can find what happened at each one of those locations and when. And this goes from August 1861 to March 1862 to November 1862, setting the stage for what happened here at this particular location. It all came down to these two generals. This was Thomas C. Hindman and James G. Blunt. Hindman representing the South, or the rebels, and Blunt representing the North, or the Federals. And each one of them was very well distinguished within their positioning and was leading a large group strategically trying to take over this portion of Arkansas because of the trade and the ports in the region. Hindman, who is the namesake of this building, was a major player in the secession of Arkansas, and thus he was determined that he was going to fight for the better interest of what he thought that Arkansas people would need based on this. And and at the same time he was going to relentlessly go and not stop. But unfortunately, as we learned at the Overlook, things did not go exactly how he might have planned them, and ultimately they were pushed back and then pushed back again. But a lot of things went into that push, so as we kind of go around, we're going to learn a little bit more about what happened. Here we find out about the positioning for battle and the strategy that went behind each of the positions. See, Hindman was a part of Marmaduke's pursuit of this area, and so they came up in the Trans-Mississippian Army from the south, converging on Cane Hill against Blunt. And in this particular endeavor, this is where the two went head-to-head for the first time, ultimately pushing them over to Prairie Grove, which is where we are, of course, today. Inside the display, you can find a variety of different interesting pieces, including this recreated journal entry from Reverend Francis Singer. He was an ordained Lutheran minister, and he was a chaplain of the Union Forces, so you can see what he has to say. But in addition, you can find some of the belongings that might have been those used by the soldiers. And here you find everything from glasses and harmonicas to a tintype of a woman, a gun, a knapsack, and other items. But the Battle of Prairie Grove itself was one that was going to be for the books, as the artillery ultimately would play a big piece in this battle. And here we can get a look at the different cannons that were used in battle here, including the ones that came from the rebels and the ones that came from the Federals, indicated on this, where you can see a picture and then also who would have used it. But something that I thought was kind of interesting is they have a little thing here that asks, can you lift the cannonball? And you can only stick your hand in this little slot, so let's try it. So a cannonball was what that they would fire, and this would project through the sky basically and hit something and leave a major impact point. It was much larger than a traditional bullet, and it could do a lot of damage. So I can only imagine that these probably are pretty weighty, so let's find out. Okay, in I go. And ooh, even putting my hand around this is hard. I could probably do it with, if it got it under there. Oh, there it goes. Oh, goodness gracious, that is heavy. I would definitely assume they are not picking that up one-handed and doing it like a shot put. No, that is really heavy. But here we also learned through this interactive display about the projectiles and the distance and the accuracy. So we have a 6-pound solid shot, which would have come from this 6-pound smooth bore, and that was a cannon that could go 1,523 yards. It looked like this, so it looked like it has a ball and then this back piece on it. And then this one could go 1,072 yards, and this came from a howitzer. Again, look at this. That's insane. This one is 1,700. The taper on the front probably helps with it a little bit, but look at this in the back. This is from a James rifle, and it's a 10-pound shell, and then this is only an 8-pound shell, but it can go 1,900 yards. In addition, you can see some of the other types of things that they might have used, from case shots to solid shot. You can see what the canister would have looked like on these, so that it would have been filled with these tiny little balls like this. Both the air and the earth quivered, and as we continue forward, you can see just how those projectiles would have been used as we continue through the battle. And you can see the advancement of the lines. Now again, watching the video really puts everything in context a bit better, so as you're moving through these displays, they make a bit more sense. I highly recommend. It's only 15 minutes, and it is well worth your time. Now, in addition to the cannons, of course, they had the hand-to-hand combat, and these are some of the items that you might have seen used for that, including rifles and swords. But then right next to that, they have the currency of the time, and these are all Confederate dollars and Arkansas Treasury warrants. Very interesting to see the difference and how that there was their own version of money for the Confederacy. See, what a lot of people don't think about is whenever you secede from a country, you're no longer a part of that, which means your currency doesn't work. You don't get the benefits of the military. You don't get the benefits of the traffic through your area that can bring you commerce or items. And you're basically foraging forward as your own country. And if you don't have that infrastructure in place, then you're not going to succeed, which ultimately is what happened in many cases with the Confederates. So as I've gone to many battlefields, I've noticed that supplies were an issue, and so that they would try to stop supply lines from the Union or the Federals. And when that didn't work out, they would have to move forward in a different direction or fall back. And so that's ultimately what happened in many cases. But there's so much more here, and so I thought we could explore a little bit more before we go outside. Here we learn about some of the casualties of war and how amputation was a major thing that happened as a result of the Civil War. In fact, right here, just the amputations for the Battle of Prairie Grove alone, there were 23 thigh amputations where only 4 recovered. There's an 82.6% fatality rate, which is insane. But there was a 100% fatality rate for a couple of the others, including an ankle and also an arm, a forearm. Medicine was not the same. And they were doing this a lot of times in really poor conditions, sometimes in a field hospital, which happened to be a home that someone was living in, that they just brought in supplies. And by supplies, I don't mean that they had like the proper things. They had just the bare minimum. In many cases, people wouldn't even have anesthesia. They instead would drink a big shot of whiskey and hope for the best. And as we're looking through this, some of these stories are just horrific. And so I'm going to leave this for you all and let you see some of the primitive tools that they would use, because it is terrifying. In total, 204 Confederates and 175 Union forces were killed, with 872 wounded on the side of the Confederacy and 808 on the side of the Union. But this was not the total number. There was a group of people who were missing and never found. And these weren't just people who fell on the battlefield and were picked up and then taken back to their families. In fact, many of these people, after they had fallen, were attacked and ravaged by wild hogs. They were left for long amounts of time and would pass away from their injuries because simply there was still fighting going on. Or in worst case scenarios, you would just get a smell. And that's actually talked about here as well in the horrors of war section. Again, I definitely encourage you all to come here. It puts war into perspective in a totally different way than you see on movies, where people just get to walk away and pretend like nothing happened. This is real, and this is why we come to places, so that we can learn from these things, so hopefully we don't end up in these scenarios again. Since it's a little bit more windy outside today, I decided to go ahead and pick up 2 of these little things that we can kind of learn from. They have 2 separate ways that you can see the park. They have a walking tour, which is about a mile long, or they have a driving tour. Now, the first stop that we stopped off at today was at an overlook, and that overlook is actually part of a larger picture. They are part of the driving tour, which is self-guided. You start right here in the visitor center parking lot, and there are some signs that say one way. They also ask you to go a little bit slower because people are trying to look and might be out and about, moving about. But inside of this little paper right here, you can find all of the stops that you can take on this little trip around the park, and each one of them tells you a bit more about the history. So for example, right here we find stop 11. That's the overlook. And you can see that it has a paragraph about it to summarize it. So if you don't want to read every single sign at the overlook, that's okay. You can get an idea of the history from this. Or you can take the time to read each sign and get a little bit of extra info. And it kind of reinforces the themes that you'll find here in the visitor center as well, which is why I always tell you to come to the visitor center. Because even though you could take the self-guided tour of either the walking path or the driving area, just coming in and seeing the context first allows you to fully expand upon that when you see it in its context. And so, for example, for me today, going out to that point, I was able to patch together some of the pieces from a place that I'd been previously, Wilson's Creek. However, even though the names sounded familiar, I didn't fully know how they were involved in this until I went inside, and then it painted the picture from Wilson's Creek to Pea Ridge to this location. And I think that that is why places like this are amazing, because it shows you that it wasn't just just a single act that happened. Even though that single act might have changed the entire landscape of an area like Prairie Grove, it was a bigger picture that ultimately factored into many moving parts along the way. As we move outside of the visitor center, we find a series of signs that set the tone as to what happened during this battle. And again, a lot of this echoes what we have just seen in the visitor center, but it gives you a three-dimensional way to see it in the context of the space itself. This is a beautiful park that was made possible by the Daughters of the Confederacy, and by preserving this, it gives everyone a piece of history to come and learn from the past so we can make a better tomorrow. It was December 7th, 1862, when the Battle of Prairie Grove happened right here in this very area. And in this area, you could find gunfire starting off from 10 till 2, until finally nightfall ended up closing out the time for the fire. And the federal loss was 1,148 versus the Confederate loss, which was 1,317. Standing before us is a battle monument, Ree's Mill. This tower was the chimney of Ree's Mill, which stood 6 miles northwest of this spot. The mill was operated by the Federal Army before and after the Battle of Prairie Grove. General Blunt's supply train was at Ree's Mill during the battle. Now, as you wander about the property, you will find a variety of different buildings at this site, and also benches, tables, small fences, things like that, to kind of set the tone as to what this park once was. Some of these things have been relocated to this property. However, it's pretty interesting to find out why. But in addition to that, they also do a reenactment once a year. This year it's going to be in December, so if you are in the year 2024 and you would like to come out and find out a bit more about this and would like to see it from a more first-hand perspective, everything is marked on their website as to when, so set your calendars. That could be a kind of interesting way to see this particular battlefield and better understand the concept of why it is so important. But with that said, I'm going to go over here and explore this home, which is in the background over here, and find out why it's here. It is because this was the Confederate headquarters, the Morrow House. This house was built in 1855 and was the home of John Morrow and his family. It originally stood in the Cove Creek area about 9 miles south of here, and on the night before the Battle of Prairie Grove, the Confederate General Hindman met with his division and a brigade of commanders in this very house. So this home was the place where they made the plan that they were going to execute the very next day and communicated that to all the powers that be. But not only that, this home was also used by another group. This was General Price on his way to the battle at Pea Ridge. So this was a wayward point where these family members had opened their home to the generals of the Confederacy to come in. Now, was that by choice? Were they loyal to the Confederacy? I do not know. However, this was where it happened. And this is a larger home, so a lot of people could have fit in here. But it's a very spectacular look on how a single property can be relocated to another property and then bring us this great bit of history so we can contextualize, again, the story of who the people are and why they were in this area. The Lord's Vineyard. This two-story log house and outbuildings were erected by John Latta in about 1834 on Evansville Creek, which is 12 miles southwest of this spot. The Latta settlement was called a vineyard from the Lord's Vineyard. Vineyard was the first post office in Washington County in 1829. John Latta was the postmaster from 1835 to 1838 and conducted officing from his home. It was also a stop on the early stage route from Fayetteville to Cane Hill to Van Buren, and this house figured in many of the stirring events of pioneer days on the Indian border. The buildings were given to the Washington County Historical Society by F.F. Latta, the grandson of the pioneer builder, and were moved to this settlement in 1958. We have now made it to stop 4 on the auto tour and also a stop on the Battlefield Trail. Altogether, the Battlefield Trail is 1 mile. It is considered easy and it is paved. And this is going to take us down to the Borden House, which is a portion of that. The Borden House was the epicenter of what one historian has called one of the most intense firefights west of the Mississippi. During the December 7th, 1862 Battle of Prairie Grove, Union and Confederate troops fought around this house and orchard and suffered hundreds of casualties. Meanwhile, the Borden family sought refuge from the fight with other families in a cellar 1 mile west of here. The day after the battle, the Borden family returned to find that their home had been burned to the ground, and the house here now was built on the same site around 1870. Right next to the Borden house is yet another version of what exactly war looks like. And here we can find one of many signs that line the walking trail. And this one shows how officers would call out to shoot the horses, and men would call out in reply, "Save the horses." And again, a senseless order would continue to be repeated until it was obeyed. At the end of the engagement that happened in this area, over 40 horses lay dead in the area for the federal troops. However, no federal troops were lost during the taking of the guns, but instead their horses. I speak so often about the context of war and the people and those who were present in that moment. And the horses were not given the option to not be there. They were just horses, right? But in all reality, a lot of the tactics that would revolve around war would be to cripple the other army or other group by any means necessary. And if that meant slowing them down by taking out their transportation, that was going to happen, and it did happen here. Now, so often when we watch movies specifically about war, we see the hand-to-hand combat, and sometimes we see fatalities amongst the animals like the horses. But in all reality, nothing that they can put on the screen can truly show you what that would have been like. But coming here and seeing the quotes from the people who were there at that moment really does put it into perspective in a way that no other way can. And that's why we come to places that are historic, to learn from those things, from those people's thoughts, and how that they have expanded upon what is going on. And I think that that is the bigger picture here at Prairie Grove. It's not the biggest battlefield that I've been to. It's also not the smallest, but it has a very interesting story that was pivotal for this part of Arkansas and ultimately could have been a huge turning point in the war if it wouldn't have happened. And so I think that it's very interesting to see how they have shared this with us at a state park level and how they continue to celebrate this area in such a way that makes it so educational for us all. This is a great day to be out here. It's windy, it's a little overcast, and overall this is a great day for some brain wrinkles. I've enjoyed this one, and I'm leaving some of this one for you guys so that you can go and watch those corresponding YouTube videos. But remember guys, we're not here for a long time, but we are here for a good time. I'm gonna get back to the van and finish this auto tour for myself, and I hope you'll come out here and see it for yourself as well. Till next time guys, bye!